everyone. Thank you for checking out my YouTube channel today, The Study of Antiquity and the Middle Ages. I'm your host, as always, Nick Barksdale, and today we are joined by a very special guest, Dr. Maeir. Dr. Maeir, thank you so much for coming on today.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm an archaeologist at Bar-Ilan University. That's in Ramat Gan, Israel. That's a city right outside of Tel Aviv. My expertise is Eastern Mediterranean archaeology of the Bronze and Iron Age, sometimes called, in my field, biblical archaeology. And I've directed the excavations, are still directing the excavations at a major site in Israel called Tel Safi, which is a site settled from the late prehistoric periods until modern times. And in particular, during the Bronze and Iron Ages, it was the site of Gat. And during the Iron Age, it was the site of Philistine Gat, one of the major Philistine sites. So I've been dealing with the Philistines and their interactions with other cultures and their formation, who they are, and a transformation of how we understand who they are for a long time. In addition to that, I'm the editor of a very important archaeological journal in Israel, the Israel Exploration Journal. I direct a research center on the relation between Israel and Aram in early times. And I keep busy. I try to keep out of trouble.
I would like to start with a very common question asked by many of my subscribers. And I'm going to pick what Yohalam asked, and that was, who were the Philistines? And where did they come from, and how did they arrive to the Levant?
First of all, that's who are the Philistines, where they come from, and how they arrived? That's a great question. And archaeological research has been dealing with this for, let's say, about 150 years. If I think of what I studied about the Philistines as a student at the Hebrew University in the 80s and 90s, and how my understanding has transformed over the last 20, 25 years, it's a very nice way of showing how exciting, how dynamic, and how enigmatic this topic is. So, for example, for many, many years, what we knew about the Philistines was really based on the biblical text. And in the biblical text, you have a quite detailed collection of stories which relate about the interface between the Israelites and Judites and the Philistines. Almost always the Philistines are presented in a negative manner. For the most part, they're presented as enemies, while sometimes they're presented as neighbors. And I always like saying, the cycle of stories about Samson. So on the one hand, a lot of the stories, he's killing Philistines. In the end, he's killed by Philistines. Even in the biblical text, he marries a couple of Philistines, and he visits the Philistines regularly. So it's a complex, multifaceted relationship. Now, you also have to remember that the biblical depiction of the relation between Israel and the Philistines is written by the Israelites, or even whether during the Iron Age or later. So it's clearly a very subjective view on the Philistines. So very early on in ancient Near Eastern studies, archaeology and textual studies, the attempt was made to try to get a more objective view, whether it's from using other ancient Near Eastern texts, whether it's Assyrian, Babylonian, or Egyptian, or from the archaeological remains. And so there's been a very interesting process in which we've sort of put the flesh on the bones, the color and the painting, in addition to the biblical story. And in some places, it fits in nicely, and in some places, it's very different. So, for example, when I started studying as an archaeology student, the accepted paradigm was that the Philistines were a group of people who were mainly from the area of Mycenaean Greece, and that was their culture. And during the upheaval of the transition between the late Bronze Age and the Iron Age, usually dated to somewhere slightly after 1200, among other things because of the depictions of the Sea Peoples, which we'll talk about in a moment, in the reliefs of Medinat Habu, of Ramses III mortuary temple. So they were seen as one of the groups of Sea Peoples who because of all the collapse that's going on in the late Bronze Age, Iron Age transition, migrated from the Aegean to the eastern Mediterranean coast, and for specifically the Philistines, the southern coast of what we would call modern Israel, Palestine, between modern-day Tel Aviv and modern-day Gaza. And supposedly they landed in some sort of like a D-Day-like invasion, captured the Canaanite cities, replaced the inhabitants with these new this new population, brought with them this Mycenaean-like culture, and then they started a process of slow change from Mycenaean through more and more assimilation, taking more Levantine aspects, until supposedly by the end of the Iron Age, they had assimilated and become local yokels, sort of another version of the local Levantines. And again, it was seen that these were mainly people with a strong connection to the Aegean world, and particularly the Mycenaean culture. And this was seen in aspects of material culture, particularly in pottery, in architecture, in hints to their language, all kinds of things like that. And there was a debate whether did they come by sea or did they come by land, but more or less that was the story. And that is how, for example, when I started the excavations at Tel Asafi Gat, among other things, aiming to work on the Philistine levels, the Iron Age levels, that was sort of the paradigm I had in my head, and that was my research agendas were based on something of the sort. So, for example, since for many years they assumed that the Philistines came from the Aegean, from the Mycenaean culture, and the Mycenaeans were writing with a linear B. And in Cyprus at that time, there was the Cypro-Minoan writing. So for years and years and years, everybody assumed it's just a question of time until we find an archive of Aegean-like script in Philistia. So I used to dream. Do I still dream? Yes, I still dream. I would love to find an archive of Philistine writing, of early Iron Age Philistine writing. But after 25 years of excavating at Tel Asafi and 100 years excavating at all the other sites in Philistia, and they really have not found any substantial amount of text, and even the few that have been found are questionable and undecipherable, etc. So, for example, one of the things that comes through is there ain't no Mycenaean writing in early Philistia. Then, to add to this, if in fact these were Mycenaean or very close to Mycenaean people who arrived in Philistia, they should come with the whole package of Mycenaean material culture. Now, some of the things do remind us of the Mycenaean, for example, pottery, the Mycenaean 3C pottery. But, for example, not all the components of the Mycenaean 3C pottery assemblage that we'll have in Greece or in Cyprus exists in Philistia. On the other hand, other aspects of the early Philistine material culture, some comes from Cyprus, some comes from Anatolia, some comes from Egypt, from all kinds of different regions. And to make that even more complex, after we've excavated 4 of the 5 major Philistine cities, that's Ashdod and Ashkelon along the coast, and Gat and Ekron slightly inland. The 5th one, Gaza, is unfortunately now not available for excavation. Hopefully sometime in the future will be. I always joke that they're excavating but not archaeologically. So we know that the early Philistine arrival didn't bring about the destruction of these Canaanite cities. And so more and more, there is a feeling, myself and Louise Hitchcock, who you have spoken to, and others, is that the Philistine culture at its very beginning is a mixed, I like calling it a Mediterranean salad. It's not a Greek salad even. they're coming from all kinds of places, an entangled culture. And when they arrive, not only do they have people from various origins outside of the Levant, but they settle with local Levantine peoples. And so the early Philistine culture is, in fact, this like amalgamation of different material cultures and different cultural influences coming together. And when the Philistines create this culture continues to exist and continues to interact with its environment, influencing environment on the one hand, but also being influenced by other cultures around there. But till the very end of the Iron Age, the Philistines retain their very distinct identity. You know, it's not as if they lost their cultural identity by the end of the Iron Age. They didn't know who they were. They knew that they were Philistines, and that a Philistine from each of the city knew that from what city, and he knew he was different from a Phoenician, from an Israelite, from a Judite, from an Egyptian, from an Ammonite, an Edomite, etc. So it's a very interesting transition going back to the question of who the Philistines were. They're groups of people. They're comprised of groups of people who came from all kinds of places during the collapse of the late Bronze Age, and it's not a one-day process or migration, but it's apparently an extended process of a century or century and a half. And they landed and they formed a culture which went through this ongoing transformation.